Texas, May 19, 1836. Dawn breaks over Fort Parker. A teenage girl stands frozen as the world she knows collapses in seconds. One strike drops her father-in-law. Another sends her mother-in-law into the dirt, blood darkening the ground beneath her. Before she can scream, before fear can even take shape, arms seize her from behind. She is dragged away, thrown onto a horse, carried into the distance as the settlement fades behind her. She is 17 years old, 6 months pregnant. Her name is Rachel Plummer. For the next 21 months, she will endure things so devastating that even years later, safe inside her father's home, she refuses to describe them fully. In the memoir she eventually publishes, she writes only this: "To attempt a full account would only deepen my suffering. For it is with the greatest humiliation that I even think of what I endured, much less speak of it." Rachel Plummer was not alone. Throughout the 1800s, across the American Southwest, frontier settlements were attacked again and again. Hundreds of women were taken. Some were returned after months or years of negotiation. A few escaped during moments of chaos, walking hundreds of miles back toward civilization. Most were never seen again, and those who did return carried stories that followed them for the rest of their lives. Stories they struggled to say out loud. Stories so disturbing that even 19th century newspapers, papers that printed public executions without hesitation, sometimes refused to publish them. These are not legends. They are documented cases. Court testimonies sworn under oath. Memoirs written by survivors and sold to readers desperate to know what truly happened beyond the edge of the frontier. And every raid followed the same pattern. They came at dawn or dusk, when light was uncertain and families were most vulnerable. Isolated homesteads were chosen first. Cabins miles from any neighbor. Places where no one would hear what followed. The men were dealt with immediately. Husbands, fathers, sons old enough to carry a rifle. There was no warning, no negotiation, no mercy. Then came the selection. Women of childbearing age were considered valuable. They could work. They could be traded. They could be forced into new lives and made to raise children who would never know another world. Young girls were taken for a different reason. Given enough time, they would forget their names, their language, even their families. They would become someone else entirely. The elderly were left behind. They could not keep pace. Infants were considered dangerous, not for who they were, but for the sound they made. A crying child could expose a group's position. This process was not emotional. It was practical. In February of 1851, 14-year-old Olive Oatman learned this lesson along the Gila River in Arizona. Her family had been traveling west with other settlers. Arguments over the route left them alone. They believed safety was only days away. They were wrong. In minutes, Olive's family was gone. When the violence ended, only Olive and her 7-year-old sister, Mary Ann, were still alive. They were forced into the desert immediately. Olive later described walking barefoot through the night over sharp stone and thorn-filled ground. No food, no water, no rest. Every stumble was punished, every delay corrected. Her little sister walked beside her, injured, silent, too frightened to cry. By dawn, Olive's feet were shredded. Every step felt unbearable. But stopping meant something worse. And this was only the beginning. Once captives reached camp, their new existence began instantly. There was no recovery period, no transition, no mercy. Work began immediately. They carried water for miles, gathered firewood until their hands split open, dug for food under an unforgiving sun. They ate only what remained after everyone else had finished. Sometimes nothing at all. They slept exhausted, woke before dawn, and repeated the cycle. Rachel Plummer later wrote, I was kept at labor from the earliest dawn until late at night. Failure brought punishment. My life was one of constant fear and misery. Discipline came without warning, for working too slowly, for showing weakness, for speaking English to another captive, sometimes for no reason at all, because there were no consequences. Olive endured this for a full year. Her sister did not. At just 7 years old, Mary and grew weaker with each passing week. Olive watched helplessly as the child she promised to protect faded in front of her. There was nothing she could do. But survivors later said hunger and labor were not what broke them. What broke them was what happened when they disobeyed, or when they hadn't done anything wrong at all. In 1838, 13-year-old Matilda Lockhart was taken. She spent 2 years in captivity before being returned during negotiations in San Antonio. When American officials saw her, men hardened by frontier violence stood in stunned silence. A woman named Mary Maverick, who helped care for Matilda, later wrote of injuries so severe that words failed her. Matilda herself spoke quietly. She described how suffering became routine, how pain became entertainment. She was often woken in the night, not by shouting, not by orders, but by sudden, searing contact against her face. Her nose became their favorite target, night after night, week after week, month after month. By the end, there was little part of her body left untouched. This was not discipline. It was cruelty for its own sake. Matilda never recovered. She died 2 years after her return. She was 15 years old. Fire, survivors said, was a tool of fear because it could be controlled. Sometimes captives were restrained and exposed while heat was applied slowly, designed to last. Other times it was routine. A heated piece of metal, a coal placed deliberately, a sudden jolt meant to correct or humiliate. But the most terrifying use came as revenge. In 1840, during a peace negotiation in San Antonio, several leaders were killed. Retaliation followed. Not against soldiers, against captives. 13 prisoners were restrained. Small fires were built nearby, not to end things quickly. Fires designed to last. The ordeal stretched for hours. Among them was a 6-year-old girl. Weeks later, a survivor described everything that had happened. The message was clear. Defy us, and everyone you love will suffer. Another ordeal came early in captivity. Running the gauntlet. Captives were forced between 2 lines of warriors. Each person struck as they passed. The goal was simple: reach the end without falling. Those who showed resolve sometimes earned slightly better treatment. Those who showed weakness marked themselves for worse. Rachel endured this more than once. She learned that showing pain only invited cruelty. By the end of her captivity, she learned to resist. When attacked, she fought back. The response surprised everyone. They laughed. They cheered. Not from kindness, but admiration. Her treatment improved. Not much, but enough to notice. Some captives faced a different fate. They were taken as wives. On the surface, it appeared better, but choice was never part of it. Acceptance was survival. One girl taken in the same raid as Rachel was Cynthia and Parker. She was 9 years old. She spent 24 years in captivity. She grew up Comanche, married, had children. When she was finally rescued, she did not want to leave. For her, rescue was a second captivity. She died heartbroken. Rachel Plummer gave birth in captivity. For 6 weeks, she cared for her child. Then she was told the child slowed her work. In her words, "They took my baby from me. I never saw him alive again." She was 20 years old. She was eventually ransomed. Her father barely recognized her. She wrote her memoir, tried to rebuild her life. She died soon after. By the 1870s, historians estimate that nearly one-third of certain native populations had captive ancestry. The frontier was not a simple story of heroes and villains. It was survival, unforgiving, relentless. Those who survived carried it forever. In their bodies, in their silence, in the things they could never bring themselves to say. History calls them victims. And they were. But they were also something else. They were survivors. Witnesses. The ones who returned to tell us what happened in places the rest of America prefers to forget. Their stories matter. Because if we forget them, we forget the truth about who we were and who we are.